Hello, class. Welcome to our recordings for Martin Luther King Jr. This is his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which he did actually write when he was being jailed. This reading, this letter has been an important part of America since it was written in '63, but in recent years, we've noticed that Americans have been talking more about race. Ever since President Obama was elected, but then also with recent media coverage of police shootings of various people. I mean, we could list the names. We've been talking more and more about race. Now, some people's attitude in the U.S. is that race and racism are just not that important anymore, that we live in a more or less colorblind society, and that most, if not all, of our problems surrounding race are sort of behind us. And then there's other people who say, no, it's quite bad, our problems with race and racism, and but now we're silent about race and racism in a way we weren't silent about it in the 60s, the 70s, etc. Of course, there's other views on it as well, but those seem to be the two dominant, the most vocal descriptions today. And so, of course, now this letter is about as relevant as ever. So we're, of course, reading it in terms of what is racism? What is the duty or obligation to challenge things like racism? To what extent is racism something that America is putting behind it? All these sort of questions. We also, though, not to take away from the important discussion of racism, but I'll also point out today a number of things about King that we can sort of piggyback on in general for our course. Like, for instance, we'll get to this in detail in a moment, but one of the most interesting points that King makes is he says, if you're neutral in a situation and there's any injustice being done, he says you're actually not neutral. When you're neutral in a situation where there's something bad or unjust going on, he says you're not actually neutral, because your doing nothing helps prop up and support those who are doing the injustice or evil. So he says we have to talk about these things, and you have an obligation if something is wrong, not just to go, yeah, it's wrong, but what are you going to do? He says you have an obligation to do something. So one way we could put this is sort of looking the other way when something bad is going on is basically as bad as the bad thing happening itself. So if you see a crime happening and you do nothing about it, you are complicit in that crime because you did nothing. So then we can use that as a spur for ourselves to sort of motivate ourselves in general for this class. That when we read a topic, sometimes there's students who, honestly, and they'll say this sometimes in the reading responses, and I appreciate the honesty, and they'll go, I just don't care about this. I think it's wrong, but I just don't care. So this is one way for us to think about it as sort of a way to motivate ourselves, is that when something's wrong, you sort of have to care. It's a heavy burden, but that's the challenge. Yeah, I'd put it that way instead. It's not a burden. It's more of a challenge that we can rise to the occasion for. And it's less of, say, an obligation, like you must do this. And more like an opportunity for us to do something good. An opportunity we can seize. So hopefully that, in a nutshell, will show you what we're going to do today. We'll talk about King specifically, about social justice and racism a little more specifically within talking about King. But I'll also make these broader points about morality and about our ethics class in general. So, race and racism have been a part of America really since our founding. since before our founding even. There were Native Americans here when Europeans first started showing up in the Americas. And then pretty quickly, in order to take advantage of all this land, we started importing slave labor from West Africa. So some people will say, yeah, okay, but that's 250 years ago, right? I mean, 1776, our revolution is almost exactly 250 years ago, right? And all that's behind us. And they'll just flatly say, look, slavery is illegal now. And in fact, the specific things that King was fighting against, segregation, where it varied state to state, but in a lot of states, blacks and whites could not use the same water fountains. They could not use the same entrances. So black Americans often had to enter businesses from a rear entrance. You couldn't use the same pools sometimes. And there were also sort of social codes where, especially in the South, but not only in the South, let's not think that only the South was racist ever, that blacks would sort of step off the sidewalk when whites were approaching from the opposite direction as a sort of show of deference and humility. And that if they didn't, then there was problems, right? It was considered rude enough that the white people would comment on it. So, similarly, you could say, well, okay, no black person steps off the sidewalk when a white person passes by anymore. There's no, white people are not going to call grown black men boy anymore like they used to in the 60s and 70s, right? So you might say, well, we've come a long way. So, I think one of the most crystallized ways to put this is that it's clear that things have changed about race, but it's not clear how much better they've gotten. So, same, people will say, well, there's no racism, there's no slavery anymore, and there's no Jim Crow or segregation laws. And say, look, we even have a black president. But if you think about the black president, he's gotten an awful lot of pushback, and a lot of it seems to have something to do with people not trusting him in a way that seems to come back to his, I guess we could say, ethnic identity, right? He's considered to be a foreigner, even though he was born in America, and all Americans other than Native Americans were originally foreigners. He's falsely said to be a Muslim, which you're allowed to be in the United States, but then that also seems to be linked to his non-whiteness. So, with a lot of these issues, we can see two sides of the same coin. We can see something about it that seems to imply that racism is going away, and then we see something else that seems to imply that racism is still, or issues around race, we could say, are still very much part of the American landscape. So, for instance, we can say, well, we live in a post-racial or colorblind society, but have you ever really forgotten that Michelle Obama and President Obama are black? I mean, I certainly don't forget it when I see pictures of them, so to say that I'm colorblind, personally, I don't think would be accurate. So here's a question I want to ask you, just in general terms. And of course, this is a sensitive topic, so be honest about what you think, but don't come charging out of the gate with a million exclamation points and name calling and all this sort of stuff. We want to have a difficult but civil, polite conversation. The basic question is this. What do you think the status of racism in America is today? Long story short, is the U.S. still racist? Okay. Now, we're all going to, because of the way I asked the question, going to be speaking in generalities. So once more, let's be sympathetic to each other, talking about these difficult issues. If someone says, yes, America still has problems with race, don't jump down their throat and say, well, my aunt isn't racist, so how dare you call her that? Same thing if someone says, yeah, in general, the U.S. is, not really that racist anymore, and you point out one clearly racist example and denounce them for being, politically backwards or whatever. No, that stuff won't fly. Okay? So acknowledge that the way I'm asking the question is a general question, and so people's responses are going to be general. So don't call them to account for the way that I've asked the question. Okay? So then there's going to be a follow-up question to the general question of basically, is America still having troubles with racism? That's the basic question. Okay? Then the follow-up would be, well, why? Why does America still have struggles with racism? Or why and how has America moved past its past struggles with racism? So a more general way to put that second part of the question is, where does racism come from? What causes racism? And what can make racism go away? Right? So again, this sort of two-part question. The first one is America still having trouble with racism? Yes or no? Okay. And then why? If the answer is no, we don't have racism anymore, how did we work past it? How did we work through it? And the answer is yes, why is it still persisting even though everyone acknowledges today that racism is bad? So, I just want to say something in response to this. It's not a direct answer to the question, but I know there's plenty of you who are going to say one of two things. Either we don't have significant racism today, or you're going to say we do, but it's a heck of a lot better than it was in the 60s, and it was a heck of a lot better then than it was in the 1860s when the Civil War was being fought. Okay. I just want to say, general point about our class, we want to be hesitant, we want to be careful of assuming that moral progress just sort of inevitably happens as time goes on. So, to this very difficult question of what makes racism go away, some of you are just going to say, well, we're more enlightened now. We're more educated. We're better morally than we used to be. But it's something I've said before, and I can't really prove to you, but it's something I hope you'll at least see why I think it before the class is over. But I think that ethics is something like the way art is. That for whatever reasons, if there's an ethical point that's a really, really strong ethical point, it makes sense to people across time and culture. In the same way that a great Leonardo da Vinci drawing or painting, you're not, over Da Vinci because it was a few hundred years ago. If you see a beautiful Greek statue, it still looks just as beautiful as an impressive artwork as it did when it was sculpted. So there's something I would roughly say timeless about ethics, that, it didn't take, 2,000 years of human history before we figured out, that murder might be a problem. Right? So I just want to be a little bit hesitant to say, back in the day, people were bad morally or ignorant morally, and just inevitably in the same way that technology and business and science sort of progress, inevitably move forward all the time, I wouldn't want you to say, well, people used to be racist and that's bad, but we naturally get better morally over time. One, I just don't think that in general that's exactly the way it works. Two, I want to point out this. In Europe, before the Americas were colonized, so before Europeans started coming over to the Americas, there wasn't a lot of slavery. There was some indentured servitude, and some of you will have classes where you know a lot of details about this. I'm not going to pretend I know all the details, but there was some indentured servitude, which was a fair bit like slavery. But that was illegal some places and not widely practiced in other places. And what we think of slavery, like American slavery, where one group of people was locked up, forcibly bred together, and kept apart from everyone else, that was not practiced in most of Europe for, thousands of years. Maybe not thousands, wouldn't be accurate, but for much of European history. So then as time moves forward, is my point, those same Europeans come to America, and then slavery seems to be acceptable. So that's just one tiny little example of Moral changes don't necessarily always move towards better, better, nicer, nicer. Sometimes they can make serious downgrades as time goes on. They don't necessarily just elevate and get better as time goes on. Another thing I want to say is that specifically King is fighting against not racism in general, but against segregation laws in particular. So these are the Jim Crow laws that basically said there's a different set of rules for black people and white people on certain things. Now, the question I want to ask is, why is segregation bad? I know it can sound sort of heartless to say that, but we ask every question in philosophy, even the ones that seem obvious or sound heartless to ask. Why would segregation be a bad thing? Okay, so that's the second question I want to ask you is, why is segregation so bad? Okay, so then my second follow-up, or my follow-up to that question is this. Even though it's now illegal to segregate, aren't we still, in fact, a highly segregated society? So since you all live in the dorms, it may not work as well for you right now, or many of you live in the dorms, but think about where you lived before the school told you who you were going to live next to. Think about who your neighbors were where you lived before. Or if you live outside of the dorms now, ask who your neighbors are now. My neighbors are all white, I'm pretty sure. And you may not know this about me yet if you haven't seen a video of me, but I'm white too. And I'm pretty sure everyone who lives, I'm trying to picture, I do have black neighbors because I see them walking by every morning getting their exercise. Presumably they don't live, 8 miles away, but somewhere nearby. But they're not my actual neighbors, and my neighbors across the street to the side, next door, in my building, and across the street the other way are all white people. And most of my friends are white, etc., etc. I mean, we could detail this. Now, maybe that's not the case for you, but for a lot of Americans, it's the case, and you can go look up stats to see how many people something similar would be true for. So here's the thing. See why this is a follow-up? If segregation is a bad thing, some of the reasons will be probably to do with the law. It's not fair in a democracy to have two sets of laws for the people. Some of them, though, will be like King's own reasons, where there's bad things about segregation, whether it's legal or not. So what's called de jure segregation, de jure just means the law, like juridical, jury, right? Okay. De jure segregation means it's the law. De facto segregation just means in fact, would also have some of the same bad effects. And America is still a highly segregated society in general. So, we may still be dealing with the legacy of segregation and its bad aspects, even if we're not as racist of a society anymore, and even if it's de jure illegal to segregate now, it's de facto still happening. And just so you have someplace to go in the text for that, in about the 6th page of our reading, and then again on the 8th page of our reading, King says specifically why segregation is a bad thing. On page 6, he gives the sort of legal reason. A law is unjust if it's enforced by the majority on the minority, but the majority more or less doesn't have to follow it. That's difference made legal, he says. And on page 8, he points out a completely different kind of reasoning, where he says, when you've got segregation, if there's one group that feels like it's inferior, not just living in a different place, but living in a worse place, and we can mean that sort of metaphorically too, like they feel their lives just aren't as good anymore. Okay? Then what happens is they're basically going to get pushed towards more and more, they're going to be pushed towards more and more desperate measures. You see this on page 10 as well when King's talking about black nationalist groups that tend towards violence. He says, as a practical measure, if you've got two groups of people and one feels that they keep getting the short end of the stick, right? He's not recommending this. He's just saying it's a fact of human nature that if someone keeps feeling like they're getting the short end of the stick for no reason, that their schools are less good, that their bodies are less safe, that they can't make as much money for the same work, okay? If they feel that way, they're going to get frustrated, right? That would sure frustrate me if I felt like that was happening. Well, frustrated people don't make great decisions. And frustrated people sometimes lash out even when it's wrong for them to do so. So there's a very practical consideration, too, that King says about why segregation is bad, independent of whether it's legal with an L or illegal with an I. De facto segregation could still make one group feel like they're getting the short end of the stick, the raw end of the deal most of the time. And when people feel that way, they lash out in anger. Right? So King says it's dangerous for a society to have segregation because the minority might try to tear away or might try to take what it feels like it's being denied, and tearing and taking are violent. We don't want to see that happen in the United States. And there's a third reason why he says segregation is bad, and this is page 4 going over to page 5. So I want you to see that a bit like some of the other readings we've done, these are 3 distinct arguments. He thinks they're all true, but one of them could be true, and the other ones could be false. Right? They could all 3 be true, none of them be true, or some combination of them. Okay? What I want you to see is that they use different kinds of logic in order to say segregation is a bad thing. The one we just did, that it leads to violence, is a sort of practical consideration. We don't want to, you don't want to poke a hungry dog and then watch it snap at you. You don't want a group of people to feel like they've got nothing to lose and so they're willing to do anything, right? That's one kind of justification for why it would be bad. The other one, the first one we gave, is that in a democracy, all laws are unjust if they treat different groups of people differently. Democracy means we're all in it together. So if a democracy has laws that split us up rather than treat us equally, that's an unjust law. But you see how those are totally different ways of viewing the problem? One is about legality in a democracy, etc. It's about applying the law equally. All 18-year-olds have the right to smoke, etc. Okay. The second one is about a risk of violence, right? And you just see that's a totally different kind of argument he's making. Okay. The third one I'm pointing out now, which is on page 4, is once more a totally different kind of argument. Okay. And this is what he says on page 4. I'll read some of it out. He says, he and his family have felt the stinging darts of segregation. They've seen vicious mobs lynch their family members. He's seen policemen curse, kick, and even kill black brothers and sisters. He sees his brothers and sisters smothering in an airtight cage of poverty. And this is the real point that he's building up to. And he says, when he suddenly found his tongue twisted and his speech stammering as he sought to explain to his 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that she sees on TV, when you have to explain to her that Funtown is closed to colored children. And this is his point. So that's all description. This is the moral why it's bad coming up. When you have to explain that to a child, that some people don't like her just because of the color of her skin, that's bad because you then, quote, see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and you see it beginning to distort her personality. She will develop an unconscious bitterness towards white people. Going over to page 5, she will live constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and she will be plagued with inner fears and outer resentments. She will forever have to fight a degenerating sense of nobodiness. So this third reason is something different. It's basically that racism twists the soul of all people involved. It twists the soul of the minority because it's constantly telling them that they're nobody or less than. And if they believe that, how crappy is that? How crappy would it be to believe that you're actually subhuman? Now, if you don't believe it, it's not a whole lot better. Because you know that you're somebody. You also know that other people think you're nobody. You know you're smart and capable. And yet you know other people look at you and think you're not as smart and not as capable. So then you'd have like this constant tension, right? This constant sense and fear and not knowing, this clash of how you view yourself and how you feel like others view you. That's bad too. So this is much more at the individual personal level. It's not about societal violence, which was the second reason I gave you. It's not about political legal representation in terms of rights and laws in a constitutional democracy. That's the first reason I gave you. This is about like the taste in your mouth, right? As an individual. How crappy would it be to have this constant sense that some people, maybe not even all, that some people think false things about you and that you cannot change their mind because they made up their mind before they ever met you. So that's why it's bad in this third general way, that it twists and distorts personalities. And here's an extra little bit. He says it twists and distorts the personalities of the majority, of the racist majority as well. Because then they start to explain everything good that happens to them in terms of their being better because they're white. Right? And then they misinterpret themselves and their personality warps in sort of the opposite way, but is also warping just as much. So as I said, those are three different reasons he gives why segregation is bad. Probably most of those apply to racism in general, even if it's not specifically segregation. And as I said, there are three distinct kinds of analysis. It's like you could say football is bad. I don't think football is bad, but you could say football is bad because the tickets cost too much. Right? It's just too expensive. And then a totally different analysis of football would be like football's bad because there's too many concussions and injuries in the sport. You see how both of those could be true, both could be false, or one could be true and the other one false. Just because they both end up saying football is bad, or King was saying segregation is bad, they operate in different ways and they sort of float independently of each other, right? So one way I like to think about it is there are two paths that arrive in the same place. They arrive in Birmingham, Alabama, we could say. Okay? But they take totally different roads to get there. So treat them as separate reasons. Don't blur them all together. Okay, so mostly here I've been talking about general themes, but I want to go through the reading sort of page by page, follow its order and its logic more closely. So we'll stop this recording here for now, and then I'll go on to sort of page 2 he says this, then page 4 he says this, etc. So we'll stop this recording here. Thank you.